Well, hello, everybody, and welcome to the Alberta Native Plant Council's new webinar mini-series, Under Pressure, Threats to Alberta's Native Plant Communities. I'm Andrea Deshane, and I'm the Education and Outreach Committee Chair at the ANPC, and I'm thrilled to be facilitating this series and to help put a spotlight on these very important topics. Before we get started for today, I have a couple of quick announcements. The in-person plant study groups are starting up again for the new year. These are monthly study groups that are held at various locations throughout the province. The next study group in Calgary is on January 20th. I see that I said January 30th. That's a typo. January 20th at 1 p.m. They're meeting at the Herbarium at the University of Calgary for an overview of urban forestry from a global and local perspective. The Central Alberta Group is meeting in Edmonton at the University of Alberta on January 31st at 6:30 with the owner of Arnica Flowers for a talk about native plants. So that's not one to miss. And the Peace River Plant Study Group meets at 6:30 on the first Thursday of each month at the Nate Centre for Boreal Research. And there's a new Grand Prairie Study Group that will be starting up soon. So stay tuned for details on that if you are in the area. And all the details for these groups can be found on the ANPC website. Lastly, ANPC has several volunteer positions available. If you want to learn more about native plants and have a lot of fun doing it, you can have a look again at the website for details, or you could just give our volunteer coordinator an email at volunteer@anpc.ab.ca. Okay, so for our presentation for today, a reminder that you can type your questions into the chat at any point during the presentation, and we'll get to those questions after. And as always, this webinar is being recorded and will be posted on our members only portal on the website. Okay, so our speaker for today is Megan Evans from the Alberta Invasive Species Council. Megan is a terrestrial ecologist with over 10 years experience in the field. She is passionate about protecting biodiversity, especially our native plants and pollinators. She contributes to those efforts through her work as the Executive Director of the Alberta Invasive Species Council and as President of the Alberta Native Bee Council. Today, Megan will present the Alien Invasion, Protecting Alberta's Native Plants from the ever-pressing threat of invasive species. I'll pass it over to you, Megan.
Awesome. Thanks so much. I'm just going to switch over here. And then, Andrea, let me know if you're seeing things properly. Does that look good to you, or do I need to switch my screen?
No, it looks perfect. We can see your notes, though.
Oh, perfect. Let's do a quick switch. Does that look a bit better?
Yes, perfect.
Okay. All right. Well, thanks, Andrea. And thanks for, Andrea really did all the hard work here in setting it up and getting everything going. So I really appreciate how organized and everything was in getting going here. So, and thanks to all of you for spending your lunch hour with us today. I feel really grateful that I get the opportunity to chat with you over lunch today. And there's quite a few people online. Goodness, this is really a great turnout. So this is fantastic that we're here talking about invasive plants today. It's, in the invasive species world, the invasive plants don't get the attention they deserve. And I know you guys, you appreciate this as much as I do. So I'm thrilled to be chatting with you about it today. We'll go kind of into detail about that here in a moment. So before we get going, I've got, just a few slides to talk about the Alberta Invasive Species Council, what we do as an organization, and some of the resources that we have that can help you with invasive species management or learning about invasive species or all kinds of things. So this is our year in review. This really sums up what we do as an organization. We do a lot of extension and outreach. In 2023, we attended 50 different events. We offer biocontrol releases for specific invasive plant species. It's kind of a big topic. We won't get into it today, but we did 76 biocontrol releases last year. We offer a couple of different invasive species reporting apps. Those are the EDMAPS apps. In 2023, we had 124 reporters, 1,500 reports, 69 different species, and 66,000 infested acres reported through EnMaps, which is really exciting. And we'll talk about that in a bit as well. We are on all the social media platforms. We're on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, and we just joined TikTok. Good grief. But we're really trying to broaden our horizons and connect with a different demographic of people and start connecting with people in a different way. We preach to our choir far too often, and we really have a lot of work to do to kind of connect with everybody else. We have, at one point last year, we had 4 staff members. We're down to 3. We have 15 board members, 33 sponsor organizations. And I just want to give a huge shout out to our annual partners. Those are rural municipalities throughout Alberta that provide funding to us every year. And we would not be as strong of an organization as we are right now with all of these resources without their support. We have 222 members. Maybe we'll get a few more after today. I certainly hope so. We offer weed identification guides, the invasive plants of Alberta guides. We have the downloadable PDF on our website, as well as print copies available as well. We have 8 different extension and outreach campaigns and programs for anything from clean, drain, dry to don't let it loose to squeal on pigs and all kinds of things. These are campaigns and programs aimed at creating awareness and helping people prevent the spread of invasive species. 150 different invasive species fact sheets. Each one of those is a one-stop shop for all things invasive, all things you would want to know about a particular species. And we held our 10th annual conference in Olds last year. And so that's kind of what we do as a nonprofit. We're not, some people think we're a government department. We're not, we're an independent nonprofit. And so these are the things that we do and the resources that we have available. So a couple of shameless plugs for some events and things that we have coming up. So our 11th annual conference is coming up on March 20th and 21st in Olds. If you scan the QR codes on the screen, it'll take you directly to our conference page. We just launched or just posted the draft agenda. So there's going to be a lot of really great stuff that we're really excited about that agenda. And we also have like kind of a complimentary pesticide applicator workshop. If there's any certified pesticide applicators, this will be happening the day before our conference. And it's, an opportunity for professional development credits for those applicators. And we will also be having an engagement session for changes to the weed control regulation. So that's the list of species that are regulated. That is going to be happening at 3:30 p.m. on March 19th. And if you register and show up for the workshop, you can go to that. Or if you register and show up for the conference, you can go to that as well. And we have a 50-50 raffle because we're a nonprofit. We've got to find lots of different ways to fund the organization. And we'll be making that draw live at our conference as well. So that's what I have for you from the Alberta Invasive Species Council and kind of what we do as an organization. So before we get going, I was hoping that folks could just put into the chat, like on a scale of 1 to 3, just how familiar you are with the topic of invasive species or invasive plants. Now, I know this is the Alberta Native Plant Council's audience, so I've got plant people here. And so I kind of want to make sure that I'll just pop open the chat here and have a quick look. Okay, we've got like a really solid mix. I'm seeing the answers coming in. So this is really good. And I see a lot of familiar names here. Hi, everybody. It's great great to have so many people showing up. Okay, we're all over the board, so that's good. So we'll just kind of try to cover things as broadly as possible. And I appreciate you entering that information for me. So what is an invasive species? We'll just start at the very beginning. So an invasive species, they're organisms that originate somewhere else and that have found themselves in a new environment where they cause harm. And they cause harm because they've arrived without the things. So that is like predators, parasites, diseases, climatic conditions, temperature, moisture, the things that would naturally suppress their population. So they're here without those, and without those natural kind of suppressants, they are allowed to grow unchecked and they outcompete native species, change the composition of native species communities, and they also change ecosystem processes. So that is a big problem, essentially. So they just completely take over and invade natural systems. And that is truly the definition of invasive species. Now, an invasive species is a little bit different. An invasive plant species is a little bit different than a weed. So when we talk about invasive plants, we typically refer to the regulated invasive plant species that we have. But we can also talk about weeds in kind of a similar context, but weeds are kind of any species that's somewhere where you don't want it. And so weeds can be native species, but by definition, invasive species cannot. So just a bit of a nuance there with the terminology. So some characteristics of invasive species, there's a big long list, much longer than this, but these are some of the big ones. So invasive species generally have pretty rapid reproduction. They'll often have generalist or exhibit generalist behavior. So they're omnivores. They'll eat anything, or they can, tolerate a wide variety of climatic conditions or, moisture levels or whatnot. So they're generalist in their preferences. They often will lack those natural predators. They can be resistant to control methods, again, tolerant of disturbances. And then they can often have other features like allelopathy, which is where, a plant exudes a chemical that kind of can deter other plants from kind of establishing around it. So all of these things give these invasive species a competitive advantage over the native species that allows them to outcompete them. And here I have the beautiful orange hawkweed on the screen. And the hawkweeds are kind of notorious reproducers. They are kind of your textbook. They throw everything at reproduction. So orange hawkweed can reproduce by seeds both sexually and asexually. They have rhizomes and they have stolons as well. So they are just really massive reproducers. So one orange hawkweed plant can infest an area of about 2 to 3 feet in diameter in a single year. So, and they're not like super wide plants. So that's pretty substantial. And orange hawkweed's really easy to kill, but you've just got to be able to get to it before it goes to seed. And if you come across a plant at this stage within the flowering cycle, and you pull it, if you were to pull this plant and throw it on the ground or take it with you and come look at it the next day, you're going to see a big puffball of seeds. So even if you're pulling these plants when they've already gone to flower, they will immediately put all of their energy into going to seed and still produce those seeds. So really challenging to get a handle on the control for some of these species like orange hawkweed. So we're going to focus in on invasive plants today, but I can't talk about invasive anything without mentioning all the other groups of invasive species, right? So invasive plants, or weeds, are very obvious. They're the most abundant and diverse group of invasive species that we have here in Alberta. We also have, invasive mussels like zebra and quagga mussels. I'm sure you've heard of those. Those are a big part of the reasons why you are legally required to stop at boat inspection stations to have your watercraft inspected. And that's true if it's a motorboat, a canoe, or a kayak. You are legally required to stop. They're looking for these mussels. They attach to hard surfaces and would absolutely devastate Alberta's water bodies and our irrigation infrastructure if they were to establish. We have wild boar, Eurasian wild boar, which are a big problem in Alberta. We do have a control program right now. We won't get into that today, but Eurasian wild boar, big problem north and west of Edmonton, and these are considered to be one of the most destructive invasive species on the planet. Really need to get a handle on those, and there's good things happening on that front with the wild boar control program. We have invasive diseases like whirling disease, which impacts a lot of our native fish. We have a goldfish epidemic. People are dumping live goldfish across Alberta. Now, this is not an issue of people, flushing the little goldfish down the toilet. This is people taking live fish and releasing them primarily into stormwater ponds, which are all connected to natural water bodies. And the result is over 100 infestation of goldfish. Every single one of those was entirely avoidable because somebody actively released them. So this one is really, really frustrating. We have aquatic invasive plants as well, like flowering rush. And these are really tricky because, as we get closer to water, our control options become a lot more limited. And then we also have invasive fungus like white pine blister rust, which is the leading cause of mortality in our 2 endangered 5-needle pine species, our whitebark and our limber pine. Again, great things happening with the Whitebark Pine Ecosystem Foundation to help, protect and to breed rust-resistant trees stock. So there's a lot of things happening in the background here, but there's lots of different invasive species. Their introductory pathways are different. The way they reproduce is different, but they all have a competitive advantage, and we all need to take action to help protect Alberta from the impacts of these species. So the status of non-native and invasive plants in Canada. So I was hesitant to include this because this report is so dated. We really need to update it. This is the Invasive Alien Plants in Canada report from 2008. There's some great statistics in here. So really quickly, as of 2008, there was 1,229 introduced vascular plants in Canada. And that makes up 24% of Canada's vascular flora, which is kind of crazy. And 486 of those are considered to be invasive or weedy. And that's across Canada, right? But it's a pretty big number. Now, 58% of those were deliberately introduced, and those deliberate introductions are predominantly through people bringing in ornamental plant species. And so that is by far the majority of how most of our invasive plants were introduced. For the unintentional introductions, it's typically through contaminants in like crop seeds or forage or things like that. So they kind of hide away and then are introduced unintentionally in that way. And over 80% of our invasive plant species come from Western Europe, and the rest, typically from Asia and certain Asian countries. And moving forward, we are most concerned about new invaders coming from the United States just because of our proximity to the US. You can see in the map here that Alberta, we're actually a bit lower with regard to the total number of invasive plant species that we have, with 225. And I don't know, I didn't dive into this report recently to figure out exactly how they were what they were defining as an invasive plant. And again, this number is probably much different now than it was in 2008, but this gives you a general idea of what we're looking at. Globally, this is the global distribution of all established invasive species, or alien species, I should say. And this is from the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. That is a terribly long name, but the IPBES, this was a really important report that came out last year, got lots of media attention, and there was really good, important information and huge calls to action for managers, legislators, and just people in general that we need to do more to combat invasive species. So the takeaway from this map is that Western Europe, North America, and Australia are leading the charge with regard to an established alien species in those jurisdictions. And then when we focus in on the different taxa, the vascular plants are by far the most diverse group of invasive alien species. So I've got that circled in the bottom left, and you can see that they're all of these taxa kind of have upward trends across the different continents. But you can see that the vascular plants, by orders of magnitude higher than many of these other taxa. So invasive plants, even though they don't get a lot of airtime, even though people don't really care about them in the way that they perhaps should, are a huge issue. They are by far the most prevalent invasive species across the globe, and they are costing us the most damage, more or less. There are a few exceptions to that, but certainly in Alberta, they're costing us the most damage. So the impacts of invasive species. So we revised an estimate from 2004 to determine that invasive species are costing the Alberta economy over $2 billion a year. Every single year in Alberta, $2 billion. That is a huge number. We need to talk about that more. That same IPBES report estimated that the cost of biological invasion, so invasive species, in the year 2019 was over 400 billion, and that's a global estimate. So again, these numbers it's hard to estimate these numbers, but it's important to kind of look at them and to talk about them because they're definitely having an impact. Invasive species are considered to be the second biggest threat to global biodiversity. And the first biggest threat to global biodiversity is habitat loss. So only after like destruction of habitat, the next biggest threat is invasive species. And that's absolutely true. When we talk about plants and the threat to biodiversity, it's really death by 1,000 cuts. Those invasive plants, they just invade, they establish, then they encroach, and they encroach, and they move, and we lose ground every single year. And so this death by 1,000 cuts scenario is problematic because we're not raising alarm bells. It's not sexy. People aren't getting excited about it, but we lose ground every single year, and that's a problem. 60% of global species extinctions have been caused either solely or in part by invasive species. So they are playing a role in our species at risk and species extinctions as well. And from the Canadian perspective, there are 44 species at risk in Canada that listed invasive plants as factors in having their at-risk status listed. So that's, again, a dated study as well. And I should update that number. So that was from 2008. That's definitely different now, but it gives you an idea. So let's talk about native grasslands. So when we talk about invasive plants and we talk about death by 1,000 cuts and the risk or the threat of invasive species to biodiversity, this is really, really kind of near and dear to my heart. So native grasslands, one of the most endangered ecosystems on the planet. And there's a bunch of different statistics. It depends on how you look at this, but multi-star lists says that 26% of native prairie grasslands remain intact. So we've lost to 3/4 of our native prairie grasslands. And native prairie grasslands are beautiful and robust and diverse. And this is probably maybe not a fair comparison. This is in the Front Range Canyons. This is a montane grassland. But we've got, incredible diversity of wildflowers here and abundance. And there's forbs and there's grasses, there's a moss and lichen layer, there's shrubs, there's trees in the background. This is a beautiful, intact, highly functioning ecosystem, and it's wonderful. So this is the same photo on the right, and then I've got this photo on the left, and this is a montane grassland that's been invaded by oxeye daisy and I think tall buttercup. And so I bring this up to you because I know that probably everybody here knows the difference between these two photos, but the vast majority of the general public sees nothing wrong with the photo on the left. It's beautiful. Daisies are beautiful. What is the problem here? And in fact, that's so much so that this was a poster, a tourism promotion poster for Fernie, BC, promoting, come to Fernie, look how beautiful, look at our beautiful wildflowers kind of a thing. And the photo on the right is a photo that I took. And we know the difference between these, but the problem is the general public is not tuned into this issue. They don't see that field of daisy as a problem, but it is a major, major problem. And here's another example. This just shows two grassland systems again. The one on the left is in Kananaskis. It is in the Sibbald area. It's completely invaded with field scabious and invasive agronomic grasses like smooth brome. There are some native forbs and some but by far the majority of the plant species in this field are invasive, and the majority of the forbs are field scabious. Contrast that with the grassland on the right, which is in the Waldron Ranch area. And this is a beautiful intact native grassland. You can see the gaillardia, there's some three-flowered avens and yarrow and cinquefoil. And this has a moss and lichen layer. There are shrubs, there's native grasses, there's plants in this field that are going to bloom all throughout the season. There's all kinds of great things. This is a beautiful, functioning, intact native grassland. Again, the general public is going to look at these two images and probably not have a big problem with the one on the left, probably think it looks just as beautiful as the one on the right. And that is a big problem because we all know that the one on the left is problematic. And it's problematic for these reasons. So invaded grasslands, you're gonna have reduced biodiversity right off the bat. You have that field scabious outcompeting the native forbs and native plant species. And that's gonna result in altered ecosystem processes. So you might not have as much nitrogen fixation or other, ecosystem processes happening behind the scenes. You can have a reduction in carbon storage in invaded grasslands. You have less resiliency to drought, possible increased susceptibility to fire, particularly if there's species like downy brome, invasive annual grasses like downy brome present, and possible increased capacity for erosion and sedimentation into water bodies. And that's particularly true with plants that exhibit allelopathy and that would have an area of bare ground around them. So really problematic. And yield losses for producers. And, the flip side of that, the contrast is true for the intact grasslands. You have high biodiversity, intact ecosystem processes, carbon sinks. Native grasslands are big carbon sinks, higher resiliency to drought and potentially fire, water filtration regulation, and really importantly, you've got really great food and shelter for wildlife species. And by wildlife, I mean all wildlife. So now some of you know that I really like bees. So I'm just going to have a quick little slide here of a case study talking about invaded grasslands and the impacts on bees. So when we lose our native grasslands, we lose our native plant species, there's major implications for Alberta's 371 native bee species, and more so for some of those species than for others. So bees need a variety of flowers, and they need flowers that bloom all season long. They need a few other things, but that's kind of the bread and butter. Now, bees like bumblebees that make up less than 10% of Alberta's native bees, there's only 30 bumblebee species. They're generalists. They'll forage on that field scabious. They're going to forage on, anything that they can find. They love big patches of things. But some of our bees, like this beautiful Duphoria mora, this is the common harebell sweat bee. She's a specialist, and she will only forage on common harebell. So in that field scabious field and that oxeye daisy field, you're not going to have any common harebell sweat bees. They're all gone. Because their host plant isn't there. They've got nothing. There's no food for them. They can't forage on it. So right off the bat in those invaded grasslands, we're going to lose our specialist bees. And the research has shown that bee abundance and diversity is highly positively correlated with flower abundance and diversity. And in those invaded systems, you've decreased your biodiversity, you've lost your specialists, and you're going to have less robust bee communities. So that's just a bit of a case study. And again, it's really problematic. And in the native grassland systems, the invasive plant species, in the way that they invade is really death by 1,000 cuts. That's a problem because we're not ringing alarm bells. People aren't getting excited. We lose ground every single year. And the public generally sees a field of oxeye daisy and thinks it's wonderful. And that's a problem too. So we really need to kind of do more to kind of work on that front as well. So I'm just going to really kind of touch briefly on some common urban invasive plants. I'm going to have to speed up here too. So these are just examples of a few invasive plants that you'll find in urban areas. The dreaded creeping bellflower, of course, oxeye daisy again, Dame's rocket. And then I have this super quick video. I don't know if this is going to work. Am I clicking on the right screen? So this is Japanese knotweed. This is a provincially regulated invasive plant species here in Alberta. This is a species that's prevalent all over the UK, and home inspectors are trained to look for it, trained to identify it. And if it is found on a property, it's unlikely that you can get a lender to give you a mortgage for it. Japanese knotweed root fragments can remain dormant for over 20 years in the soil. And when they're active, they can grow 3 to 4 inches a day, and they can bust through 3 inches of concrete. They pose risk to infrastructure, and in urban areas, they're really problematic. Japanese knotweed is prevalent in areas like Vancouver and certain parts of Canada. This is also what it does. These huge monocultures, it grows like crazy. We do have isolated locations of this in Alberta, primarily introduced through the ornamental trade. And again, this is a species that's like really easy to grow, establishes really well, low maintenance. And that's part of the reason why it's got all of these competitive advantages, and it poses a major risk to home foundations and roads and bridges and infrastructure. So just an example of some urban kind of problems as well. So we have the regulated invasive plant species, and I probably should have talked about those first. That might have made more sense, but I know a lot of folks are tuned into that issue. But we have unregulated invasive plant species that are majorly problematic. I've got 4 examples on the screen here. We've got birdvetch, Sisser milkvetch, timothy, and smooth brome. These are what we would call kind of invasive agronomic species. They're still widely used as forage species and reclamation species throughout Alberta. And producers love things like Sisser milkvetch. I go to producer meetings, we talk about it. They're frustrated because they love it. It's a non-bloat species. It's all these things. It's great for them. And I'm okay with Sisser milkvetch, but I'm not okay with it when it spreads into natural areas. Because if you live in the city of Calgary, and maybe Edmonton too, you know that there's Sisser milkvetch and there's a major problem with it. It is everywhere, and it's not regulated. So even if there's an invasive plant management program and people controlling weeds or invasive plants in that area, they're unlikely to control these because they're not required to, because they are unregulated. So these species are really problematic. The grasses maybe even more so. Smooth brome, the invasion continues every year. Smooth brome gains ground, and because it's a grass, you can't use selective herbicides on it, and it's a hard species to control. So this is a major gap that we need to address here in Alberta if we want to be successful in truly protecting our biodiversity from the impacts of invasive species. So this is the world's most boring slide. I'm sorry, but it was got to be done. So in Alberta, we do take our invasive species really seriously. So we have the Weed Control Act. That is one of our oldest pieces of legislation in Alberta. And that lists the regulations aspect of that act lists our 75 regulated invasive plant species. We also have the Fisheries Act in Alberta, which in 2014 underwent an update to add 52 prohibited aquatic invasive species. The Agricultural Pests Act, which lists wild boar, Norway rats, and other pests and invasive species. There's also the Federal Canada Seeds Act, which lists a number of prohibited seeds. And there can be municipal level bylaws that can prohibit or elevate a species, so that they could elevate a species to noxious or weed species, or prohibit entire species in general. Sorry, just a sip of water there. So the Weed Control Act. So this is, again, really boring stuff, but it's important. So the Weed Control Act lists 2 different categories of weeds or invasive plant species. So there's prohibited noxious. So it's kind of a higher category. And for prohibited noxious weeds, a person's required to destroy them. If you have prohibited noxious weeds on your property, you're required to destroy them. Now, that's in contrast to noxious weeds, where a person is required to control them. And the difference really comes down to the prevalence or the abundance or the widespreadness nature of the species in question. I'll show you that in a moment. So prohibited noxious weeds are not more invasive. They're not badder. They're not worse. And noxious weeds are, less problematic. It really comes down to how common, how prevalent, how abundant they are, and whether or not they're eradicable. The poster on the right here, there's a poster that we have. This lists a number of the common noxious weed species in Alberta. And I'm really going to emphasize that right now there's currently revision underway to the weed control regulations, which is the 75 regulated, either prohibited noxious or noxious species on the weed control regulations. So the province is currently updating that list. And again, we have an engagement session kind of connected with our conference where we're going to try and get feedback on those revisions. I know ANPC will be invited to provide feedback on that as well. But it's not, my understanding is that it's not fully open for full-on public engagement. So connect with ANPC, connect with us if you'd like to provide your feedback. It's important that we get feedback and that everyone has a say in kind of what those changes look like. So let's talk about prohibited noxious and noxious. So the map on the left is noxious weeds, is of a noxious weed species, tall buttercup. So this is the image of tall buttercup. Tall buttercup is super prevalent in Alberta. It's all over the place. It's not eradicable. So that's why for noxious weeds like tall buttercup, the onus is to control them. So again, it's not a worse or less worse invasive species. It's really about the widespread nature of the weeds and the fact that tall buttercup is not eradicable. Now compare that with sulfur cinquefoil, which is, this is the image of it on the screen. It's not fully open. The flowers are not fully open. This is a prohibited noxious species. As you can see, this shows one location. I think we have a second location now. Sulfur cinquefoil, we're still trying to essentially eradicate. We only have 1 or 2 locations. We want to keep it that way. We need to have eyes on the ground, and we need to make sure that we eradicate sulfur cinquefoil. That's why this is listed as prohibited noxious, and this is why landowners are required to destroy the plant and all parts of it. So that's kind of your difference between your noxious and your prohibited noxious, and it really comes down to this curve. This is the invasion curve. And this is kind of boring stuff too, I think, to a lot of people, but it's really important. And it's really important to understand why we would take different management actions for different types of invasive plant species or different types of invasive species in general. So this is the invasion curve. We have area occupied on the y-axis as well as costs, and then we have time on our x-axis, sorry. So on the left-hand side here, you can see this is before an invasive species even arrived. This is when you're implementing prevention activities to prevent a species from establishing. So an example of a species that we are focusing on prevention for would be zebra or quagga mussels. We've talked about those already. Zebra and quagga mussels, were they to establish in Alberta, would cost the Alberta economy $75 million every single year. Now, we know that the government funds these boat inspection stations, and they cost less than $1 million a year. So the cost for those prevention programs, less than $1 million, and the cost were they to establish is $75 million annually. And researchers have shown, you see the ratio on the bottom here. This is kind of a general kind of model, but for every dollar we spend on prevention, we can expect to see about $100 of returns down the line. So this is really key, right? So it's huge return on investment. For every dollar you spend on a prevention activity, $100 in savings. We need to focus more on prevention. The single most effective way to manage invasive plants is to prevent them from establishing in the first place, and it's the most cost-effective way too. So let's say we didn't succeed in totally preventing them. We have some infestations, like the example here would be sulfur cinquefoil. We just talked about that, 2 infestations that we're aware of in Alberta. The goal here is early detection and rapid response, and is ultimately eradication. And that's what we're doing with sulfur cinquefoil. And that is a bit more costly. So for every dollar you spent in eradication or early detection, rapid response, you can expect about $25 of returns. So that's a 1 to 25 of return on investment. It's still pretty good. And that's kind of where we are for a species like sulfur cinquefoil. So if we fail in our eradication efforts and we move into the containment phase, and that's where, you know, you're no longer going to be able to eradicate it. It's just not feasible. And an example of a species that we would be focusing on containment with would probably be orange hawkweed, which we've already seen as well. Now, I do want to point out that this graph and these categories are scalable. So you can scale them up to the provincial level, and you can scale them down to the individual landowner level, up to the township or municipal level. Whatever scale you're working in, you want to plot your species on this curve to figure out the most appropriate management approach, right? And where's your winnable battles, and where is your best investment? So that's why this graph is so important, but the scalability of it, I can't emphasize, is really critical to think about as well, because orange hawkweed's probably in the containment phase for Alberta, but it's probably still in the prevention phase for a lot of municipalities, townships, and landowners. So once you move out of the containment phase, you get into a Canada thistle dandelion type scenario. And if you know what I'm talking about there, I mean that they're just everywhere, where you're into an asset-based protection scenario with these species that have just been, they're at the highest level of the invasion curve. The area occupied for these species is massive. The cost associated with these species is massive. We're seeing crop yields ecological damage, reduced ecosystem services, all kinds of things, right? So really, you're in an asset-based system where you're an asset-based protection kind of scenario where you're just trying to keep these species off your property. So this is the invasion curve. It's kind of boring, but it's really important. And then I do want to talk about prevention. So we just saw, your biggest return on investment, right, is investing in prevention. So this was a study that came out in 2022, and researchers using this really cool new database, they figured that invasive species cost $1.2 trillion globally since 1960. That's not really the important part of the slide. What's important here is the money, the way we're spending our money. So the most of those costs are coming in the form of damage costs, yield losses, and other types of damage associated with invasive species. That's the orange part of the pie. The blue part of the pie is management. It's quite small. And then you can barely tell, but there is a yellow piece of the pie, and that is prevention, which is kind of bonkers because we just saw that if we spent $1 on a prevention activity, we get $100 in returns down the line. So we really need to be spending more money on prevention, right? So again, this is just saying the same thing again. I'm beating a dead horse here, I know, but this is so important too. This is the prevention paradox. So for every $1 invested in prevention, we save $100 down the line, yet we spend the very least in prevention. We spend almost nothing on it. This is a problem. So we can actually, so this again is showing the same chart. I probably didn't need 3 slides of this, but again, driving home a point here. Prevention programs yield the highest return on investment, yet we invest the least in them. So this is the actual assessment of how invasive species money or costs are spent. And it's very, very small amount on prevention, very small amount on management. But you can see this pie chart is smaller. So in an alternative scenario, if we shift how we spend our money on invasive species, we spend more on prevention and we spend more on management, we can shrink the overall costs of invasive species. But we're not doing that. So this is something that needs to happen. We need to talk to, regulators, legislators, people that are responsible for allocating money for invasive species programs. We need to do more here. We can reduce these costs. We can do better. So what can you do? How can you prevent the introduction and spread of invasive species? So you can learn to identify invasive plants and report them. I know if I'm talking to the Alberta Native Plant Council folks, you already know how to identify all these things, but you can also report them, and we'll talk about how in a moment. You can become a plant-wise gardener. Plant-wise is just kind of the name of our plant-wise programming, where we create awareness of the fact that we still see invasive species, regulated invasive species in some instances, sold in greenhouses and nurseries and at plant swaps. So become a plant-wise gardener, be aware of these things. If someone's trying to give you a plant that does really well, takes no maintenance, just reproduces like crazy, that should sound some alarm bells for folks. It might be a bit of a problem. Included this bullet as well, which is to purchase certified weed-free products when possible. And I have the weed-free kind of certified logo on the screen there. We don't have a lot of weed-free products in Alberta. It's a program that we're working on building. We currently have weed-free forage program in place with not a lot of forage available. And we're looking into weed-free gravel and some other products as well. They're hard to get them going, but we're optimistic that we can play a role in really facilitating the production of these certified weed-free products because, contaminated forage, contaminated, weed seeds and gravel, major way that these seeds get spread around. Clean your gear. That's another one that we can all do, like simply coming clean and leaving clean. If you're out hiking, if you're anywhere, knock the mud off your boots, have a look at your shoelaces and your socks. Do you have burrs attached? Is there grass seed? Just simply cleaning your gear and not allowing kind of weed seeds to spread through contaminated mud on your boots or tires or whatever can actually be really effective, and it's really easy to do. So play clean go, clean your gear, really effective way of preventing the spread, and play a role by making sure you control invasive species on your property as well. So for reporting invasive species, we have these EDMAPs apps. So the early detection and distribution mapping system is the worst name ever. But you bear with me because it's a great app. I wish it was named something cooler and more fun and more exciting because it's so great. But it's just, again, we're not getting people as excited about this as they should be. So there's QR codes throughout the presentation I should have mentioned. So if you just like open your camera, it'll take you to our website where you can download either the EDMAPs app for Android or for iPhone, free downloads. You do have to sign up for an account. If you're not an iPhone or if you're not a smartphone user, you can use the online web platform. Again, you'll need an account there. It takes a moment. It's all free. but it's really, really great. So these apps, once they're downloaded on your phone, you can use them at a cell service. And that's perhaps when they're most useful, I guess. Like if you're in a remote area and you find something you don't know what it is, or if you find something you do know what it is and you know it's a problem, take a photo, submit it through EdMaps. It's a really easy process. And when we get those reports, we do send them off to the local authority for follow-up. So in a lot of cases, that's going to be people in rural municipalities. That's going to be national parks, might be the city of Calgary, might be city of Edmonton. We will notify that their pest management people and let them know that this species was reported, and then it's up to them to follow up. But this can be a really effective tool in early detection of new species. And I'm putting a call out to all of you here because I know you guys know your plants. So you can be aware. You guys are the people that are probably going to be able to identify if this is a new species, if this is a problem, if this is an invasive species you haven't seen before. Those are the ones that we really, really, really want you to report. It's so incredibly valuable. We value all of the reports that come in through EdMaps, and we do send them off, and they're all submitted to these publicly available distribution maps. So this is really cool. This is underused as well. So this is through the EdMaps database on edmaps.org. You can query all of the EdMaps reports that have ever been submitted through EdMaps in Alberta. And if you take, again, a photo, you scan this QR code, it'll bring you to these live query results where you can zoom in and out and have a look at all of these reports. So I did a query for all of the EdMaps reports submitted to date through the EdMaps system. And the result was, I've got my notes here, 24,455 locations, 741,000 infested acres, and 458 records with revisits. This database, these data are valuable. They're valuable for us to show legislators and politicians, hey, this is a problem. We need to do more. These things are super widespread. They're causing a lot of problems. This is a valuable database for researchers to understand spread of invasive plant species, risks, habitat suitability, all kinds of things. This is really powerful. And it's also great if you're managing an invasive plant management program. You can use this and you can just simply copy the hyperlink and send it to someone and they can play around with the data as well. So really, really important resource there. And as if you needed any more encouragement or incentive to report invasive species through EdMaps, we also have an award for the person that submits the most EdMaps reports in a single calendar year. It's called the Big Ed Award. It is this fabulous leather and metal full-size wrestling belt. And it is awarded to the person that again submits the most reports in a year. Now, in addition to that person's name being engraved on the Big Ed belt, they also get free registration to our conference. So Crystal Ianson, our very first EdMaps award winner, I think she was a two-time winner. And here I've got Jerry Ellert. And Jerry, I saw your name on there. I know you're there. So this is the wonderful Jerry Ellert, who does incredible things and so much volunteer time in combating invasive species in the Medicine Hat area. I just can't thank you guys for all that you're doing and all of the reports that you've submitted through EdMaps. So this is a lot of fun, you guys, and it's really important and it's fun. And who doesn't want their name engraved on that belt? I'm just saying, it's a pretty great thing. So you'll have to stay tuned for who our 2023 award winner is. I haven't checked yet, so that'll be announced at our conference. So I know I'm running out of time here. I'm going to speed up. I'm getting to the end of my slides. I've got, oh goodness, okay. So managing invasive plants, no silver bullet. We all want that silver bullet, but there's no silver bullet. It's so much easier said than done. Integrated pest management is key. And what integrated pest management is really just taking a holistic approach to managing invasive species. That involves monitoring. If you're not out there with eyes on the ground and you don't know what you have, then you can't do any of these other things. So you need to be monitoring early detection, rapid response, right? EdMaps, really important for that. Having really knowledgeable folks like you out there on the ground, being our eyes on the ground for looking out for new invaders, really, really important. Making sure we proper identification of species. We reach out to some of you sometimes for help with that. And that's a really important part of this. We need to be using lots of different control methods: chemical, hand pulling, mowing, grazing, biocontrol, all of those things. We need to use all of the tools in the toolbox, and we need to use them at the right time. And we need to follow up. We know that there's going to be seed in the seed bank in any instance where there's invasive species. I've got common mullein on the screen here, and common mullein produces seeds that can be viable in the seed bank for 100 years. So this is a long-term game. We need to be on top of this. Considerations for control. Again, there's no silver bullet. You need to be factoring in all of these things before you even start figuring out how you might go control invasive plants. Abundance. Are you do you live in the city of Calgary and you have an average size urban lot? Or are you a producer with 4 quarter sections and you have a huge infestation of leafy spurge, right? Those things are that abundance factor is going to play into that. The life cycle, the life stage, are you dealing with an annual that reproduces by seed, a biennial, or a creeping rooted perennial? So you need to look at what type of plant you have and what stage it is in its life cycle. You need to figure out all the ways it reproduces, attack all of those and target all of those reproductive strategies, and never, never, never dispose of invasive plants in compost. Always go in the black bin. And some cities even have proper disposal areas for invasive plant species as well. I think the city of Calgary is one. I'm sure there's others. Just check in with your local municipality. There's identification resources. Again, I think with this audience, you guys don't even need these, I'm sure. I use Picture This app. Don't tell anybody, but I encourage people to use it. I mean, it's not perfect and you have to be aware of that, but it's real handy. That's the one where you just take a photo, and if you're totally lost, it might point you in the right direction. So it can be helpful. The Alberta Wildflowers app, that is an amazing resource. So it lists all of our Alberta wildflowers plus invasive species on there as well. And that kind of like asks you questions. So, you know, I've got a 4, it's got yellow petals, 5 petals, and it'll start narrowing it down to the options that it could be. Pardon me, we have the Invasive Plants of Alberta Guide. This was the 4th edition. We released it in 2022. You can scan that code and get a PDF copy right on your phone, or you can order hard copies on our store. Where, you know, we've applied for grant money to print those so that we can provide them at a subsidized cost. They're $1 per guide plus shipping, which is a subsidized cost, and we're happy to do that. So we're happy to be that resource, and we want everyone to have a copy of these guides because they're so useful. So some of the gaps in invasive plant management here in Alberta, from my perspective, I would say those unregulated species, like I should have that red and underlined. I think this is a major problem. These forage species are hugely problematic. They're spreading. They're not being controlled. They're not necessarily on everybody's radar. I'm sure they're on some of your radars. And some of the species that are too far gone, they're still posing problems. They're still costing us money. They're still impacting biodiversity. So those are the Canada thistle and dandelion, although Canada thistle is a regulated species, but I would argue that is perhaps too far gone. We are still finding regulated species being sold in greenhouses and nurseries and at plant swaps. It's like Groundhog Day. It'll happen again this spring. We'll start getting calls in from people. You know, we're finding perennial baby's breath, Dame's rocket in Canadian Tire. You know, we're finding these things everywhere still. We need to do more to combat that prevention side of things, right? Wildflowers, seed packets, major problem. There's no requirement to list Latin names, and so I don't even think you have to list common names on them. So not only do you not know what you're buying, you don't know what might be contaminant in there as well. Now, when I talk about wildflower seed packets, I don't mean the ones that Manna with Arnica Wildflowers has, or ALCLA, or any of these native seed and native plant producers. Those people know what they're doing. I'm talking about the ones you could buy from Canadian Tire or Home Hardware. Steer clear of those. Those are problematic. There's also a major lack of investment in prevention. I won't even go into it anymore. You guys know the most effective way to manage invasive species is to prevent them from establishing in the first place, and is the most cost-effective way to manage them as well. We need to do more. We need, I don't know a single invasive plant management program in Alberta that is, you know, well resourced. Every single one of those program managers would say, I need more resources. So we're not resourcing these management programs enough. Everyone is getting by with too little. We're not doing enough with regard to management. We need an increased investment in biocontrol as well. So biocontrol, again, we didn't have time to talk about it today, but it's a really important tool in the toolbox. And biocontrol is a really important control method for really widespread invasive species. Now, biocontrol agents take decades, sometimes decades, and millions of dollars to research and get approval for release. And we're involved with that. We're currently working with researchers overseas and Ag Canada to find a common tansy biocontrol agent. I don't know if you're in a common tansy hotspot, but we could sure use a biocontrol agent for common tansy. So we're optimistic in the next 5 to 10 years, we'll have those agents out on the ground doing their thing. And we need increased extension. Like we said, the Mount Fernie photo with the intact native grassland photo, right? The public thinks both of those are okay. They're not okay. We need to do more to increase awareness. We have 2 more slides, Andrea. I'm going to be wrapping up here right away. So what are some simple things you can do? kudos to everyone that's here today. You've already done something today to help protect Alberta from the impacts of invasive species. Hopefully you learned something. I know I'm preaching to my choir a lot with the audience that we have today, but just by showing up today and being a part of this, that's really great and really important. And talk to others. Tell some folks about some of the things that we talked about here today. We really need everyone's help, boots on the ground, to help spread the word. Learn to identify invasive species. Again, you guys probably know how to identify them better than I do. Report, especially with this group of people who know their plants. If you see something and if you don't know what it is, that's okay. Send us a photo, send a thread maps, let us know. We'll find out and we'll help you find out and we'll get to the bottom of it. Implement those best practices. So be plant wise, clean your gear, tell people not to dump their goldfish, all those kinds of things, and get involved. So we offer annual memberships, much like the Native Plant Council. If you're a part of an organization, please consider becoming an annual partner. Our partner organizations are, again, a big part of the reason why we weathered COVID, why we're still here, and why we're strong and still creating resources and doing work like this. Please come to our conference in the spring and summer, attend a weed poll. There's a lot of different ways to get involved. So to summarize, invasive species come in all forms. Every different type of organism you can imagine, there are invasive species for that group. They cost the Alberta economy over $2 billion annually, and the majority of those costs are because of invasive plants. And invasive plants are a major threat to biodiversity, including our native grasslands. Again, death by 1,000 cuts. We don't get enough airtime for invasive plants. People don't get excited about them. We're not ringing alarm bells, and we really, really need to be, because we know how important those native grasslands are. Just the inherent value in their beauty and biodiversity and those things, let alone all of those other things that we talked about earlier. Regulated and unregulated invasive plants are a problem. And again, there are going to be revisions to the list of regulated species in Alberta. So stay tuned for information on that. And everyone does have a role to play in preventing the introduction and spread. And I know that you folks are definitely engaged with that. And we sure appreciate your help in protecting Alberta from those impacts. So with that, I've got my contact information on the screen. Our conference details, if you scan the QR code, you'll find them there. Newsletter sign up is in the other QR code. And we're on all those social media platforms. We have a lot of fun, especially with TikTok. So join us on those platforms as well. And that is all I have. So thank you very much for all of your time today. Maybe I'll stop sharing.
Awesome.
Yeah.
That's great. Thank you so much, Megan. That is great. I'm gonna share.
Awesome.
Yeah, thank you so much. I'm really glad you mentioned the EDD Maps app. I use that. I love it. And also, you know, I thought your point about getting familiar with the Latin names was obviously near and dear to my heart, but I really appreciated that as well. I know it can be pretty intimidating sometimes. People tend to use common names, but you know, that can lead to confusion. And the only way to really know what you're dealing with is the Latin names. So that I'm glad you brought that up. We do have time for a few questions. Quite a few have come through. I've been kind of keeping track. One that came up was, are nurseries regulated or overseen in some way in terms of where they bring in plants from? Or, you know, is it really kind of buyer beware? Or, you know, does the responsibility really lie with the end user?
So that's a loaded question. So yeah, I mean, ultimately you can't buy or you can't sell regulated invasive plant species, right? It's a violation of the Weed Control Act. The problem with that is that, you know, Canadian Tire goes and buys all of their nursery stock for the whole country. They have like one Canadian buyer, and then what you're going to get in Alberta might be similar to what you get in New Brunswick, given the hardiness zones or something like that. So there's no, because we're dealing with Alberta-based restrictions, and a lot of these companies are federal in nature, there's a gap there. There's no one really. We do have a provincial weed officer, you know, but he can't go out to all of those things. He goes to all those stores, but we get reports of them. People, if you see something that is regulated, that is in a nursery, you tell us, we will get somebody there. There's also in every municipality, there's weed inspectors that can be sent out. So City of Calgary has weed inspectors, all the rural municipalities, we'll get in touch with them and we'll send them out to the store to follow up. So if you see something there, so that's how we police it. It's not perfect. And again, we need to really focus on preventing them from getting in there into the system in the first place.
Yeah, use that EDD Maps. It's fantastic.
Yeah.
So kind of on that same note, obviously the Alberta Weed Act is provincial, but do we have any federal legislation that applies to invasive plants in Alberta?
So really just the Canada Seeds Act. So there's a number of species that are prohibited through the Canada Seeds Act. So which is a bit different, right? So when things are coming across, I think there needs to be better, right? I think we need revisions on some of these regulations and legislation, right? And so I think Alberta, looking at their Weed Act species is really good, and we need to do better. But the one that comes to mind federally is the Canada Seeds Act. I don't know that it's perfect either, but yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's great to hear that the Weed Act's getting revised. I mean, it was 2010 when it was redone the last time, and it's definitely due. Which brings me to my next question, actually, is where primarily do the recommendations come for what species to include during these consultations that are going to be held? Is it, agriculture industry, or is it ecologists? Where are you seeing most of the consultations coming from?
So that's all overseen by the government, the province, and we weren't a part of that. So my understanding is that they had some like core stakeholders, like rural municipalities, like Ag Service Board people, and I'm not actually even totally sure, but the provincial weed inspector was the one that was overseeing this from Alberta Agriculture. So the Weed Act legislation comes from Alberta Agriculture. That's not to say that they don't take like environmental, issues into consideration as well. So worked with their core stakeholders to work on the revised list, and basically they're going to be pushing that out to this extended extension opportunity, and that's when everyone will have an opportunity to have their say. I know they widely use the weed compendium. Now I don't even know if that's a publicly available document. This was, and I can't recall who developed it, but basically it was like the status of all these different invasive plant species in Alberta. So again, I'm just kind of speaking from little bits and pieces that I've gotten from the province, and we haven't been involved with that. But I think they're going to be putting forward to ANPC, to AISC, and some other groups the proposed list based on their initial stakeholder consultation, and then we get to provide feedback on that. So I would encourage you, especially ANPC, I know you've got a lot of biologists and ecologists in your group to participate in that.
Yeah. Okay, awesome. I know this is actually kind of my question. I mentioned this to you before. Alberta Invasive Species Council lists, those wonderful fact sheets, which I would encourage everybody to go have a good look at. There's incredibly detailed fact sheets on all the invasive species, but of course I'm partial to the plant ones, but you can go in and look at whatever taxa you're interested in. But you obviously focus on the regulated ones. Do you have any intention on creating something for, the non-native invasive species, the problematic species, the unregulated guys?
So we have some fact sheets for some of the unregulated species, but not all of them. And it's really just, we have a list of species. We have a fact sheet request form. If you think a species needs a fact sheet, send it to us. We'll try to get it made. Although Jerry Ellard is probably still waiting for his climbing nightshade fact sheet from 3 years ago. It's a bit of a resource issue for us, but we did include in the new Invasive Plants of Alberta guide, a bunch of unregulated species, because people need to know that these are a problem as well. They're not as robust descriptions and information as in the fact sheets, obviously, because it's such a small guide, but we are working on it, I guess, is the short answer. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great booklet. I have a digital copy, a paper copy in my field backpack. It's a really great little handy to go resource. I'd recommend everybody download that as well. I guess I'll finish off with this last question that has to do with the booklet. Is your booklet on invasives available in schools? And what would it cost to send it to all the schools in Alberta? Ooh.
I don't know. How many schools are there in Alberta? Yeah. So we are trying to connect. So it's not in all the schools. It's absolutely not. And we don't do a good job of kind of connecting with schools and teachers. We have been applying for grants to do different things like build curriculum components to get it, because we only have 3 people, so we can't go to all the schools, but what we can do is build resources for teachers, and obviously this would be a great one. So yeah, if you have ideas on how we can get these into the schools, then we're all ears. Often for us, it's like we can distribute these, but the shipping can actually be a problem unless we have grant money to cover it, right? You can't just create money. And shipping, you guys, have you seen how expensive it is to ship things these days? So it gets really expensive, but if you have ideas or ways we can do that, we're all ears. Please reach out.
Yeah, I love that idea. Start with the kids, right? That's ground level.
Totally.
All right. I think that's our time. Thank you so much, Megan. And thank you everyone for sharing your lunch hour with us. A recording will be made available to ANPC members. And remember to keep an eye out for registration to open up for our next webinar in the series, which will be on February 13th, when we'll welcome Dr. Richard Schneider. On behalf of ANPC, thanks for joining everyone today. Take care.
Thank you.